The easiest way to learn how to make your own art is to start by copying someone else's. If you can break down and replicate a style you like, you can use those exact same steps to create something original. And if you don't own a drawing tablet or feel like you lack traditional drawing skills, Inkscape is the perfect tool to get you started anyway. In this video, I put together a collection of my previous tutorials focusing on famous games and shows, where we'll see how to replicate these iconic looks using just a keyboard and mouse. We'll start with the vibrant cartoony art of Among Us, then pivot to the dark atmospheric silhouettes of Limbo. Next we'll shift to cartoon backgrounds, drawing a scene in the style of Adventure Time, and wrap up by cloning a backdrop from the classic graphical adventure Sam & Max Hit the Road. Alright, let's get started. What you're seeing right now is not a custom Among Us map. It's an original environment I created entirely using Inkscape. I then dropped it into the Godot game engine to make a quick improvised mockup, just to show you how these assets might look inside a moving game. The point of this video is simple. You can make game-ready art at the level of a game like Among Us, using nothing but vector tools in Inkscape. And it's not as hard as you might think. This video is a follow-up to my last one, where I compared pixel art and vector art, and made the case that indie developers and beginners should really consider switching to vector workflows. Link in the description if you want to check it out. And the clean, cartoony art style of Among Us, it's a perfect match for vector illustration. So let's put that theory to the test. Can the tools of Inkscape help us make game art? If you're making your own game, you'll need to make a lot of art quickly and efficiently. In the case of this ship map, you'll need to be able to create rooms and hallways fast. So let me show you some of my favorite tools in Inkscape to do just that. You see these repeating floor patterns, like the tiled dining room, the reactor steel plates, or the hallway grates. Depending on the complexity, these floors can be made of multiple shapes, which makes them tricky to modify and adjust for new areas. Luckily, Inkscape's custom pattern feature is perfect for this. It lets you take any object you draw and fill other shapes with it. It's very similar to using a texture in a game engine, because you can adjust the path shape and the pattern will still work perfectly. You can even warp the pattern by scaling the object, which makes it even more flexible. That's how you can apply patterns to inclined walls like this. The great thing about patterns is that because they're basically just a fill on a path, you can stack multiple patterns to build more complex and variated surfaces, like this wall on the planet map, which combines three patterns: the blue and gray wall base, the bricks, and the ice. You could do all of this without using a single pattern, of course, but using patterns leads to a much more flexible, modular, and reusable way to build environments. It's kind of like a game engine, but inside Inkscape itself, and with much more control. Among Us has a lot of mechanical looking objects: pipes, vents, stair rails, wires, all of that. And Inkscape has the perfect feature for this: path effects. Specifically the pattern along path effect, which lets you design something once and then bend it along any path you draw. Take a look at these chains. It's super easy to make with the pattern along path effect. And then you get a path you can adjust however you want. Same with this fancy wire, or these tubes, or the rails. It's easy to create and just as easy to resize and reposition. Pattern along path is already powerful, but if you combine it with the extension of the same name, which lets you spread whole groups over other paths, then you get something that helps you create entire rooms out of modular pieces. But you still need to dress that room with something, and that's where another time-saver tool comes in: clones. Let's say that you finish an asset, like this fire extinguisher, and you want to spray it around the ship. So you duplicate it a bunch of times, but as often happens in game development, later you need to make a change. That usually means replacing each copy by hand. Clones solve this. With clones you can duplicate the original, and any change you make to the original will be updated across all the copies. If at any point you want to make a variation or add a unique detail, You can always unlink that clone and edit it directly. It's a super flexible system. For game art, where repeated objects are everywhere, this is incredibly helpful. Now, one of the reasons Among Us looks so good is that even with its simplicity, it still has this hand-drawn flash feel that I adore. Very likely some kind of vector program was involved at some moment. Maybe not Inkscape, but something similar. The good news is that you can get that same organic hand-drawn look in Inkscape, even without drawing with a tablet. And speaking of drawing with a tablet, personally I'm not a fan of Inkscape tablet tools. They're just not at the level of something like Flash. But you can get more organic lines using the built-in path effects in the shape options of some of the drawing tools. It works and it gives decent results, but I much prefer to draw with keyboard and mouse, and there is a really nice path effect that can simulate any kind of stroke, whether tapered or organic or whatever you want. It's called power stroke. You'll need to adjust it manually after each stroke, but if you do it right, it looks great and it gives you the precision of a mouse-made line with the organicness of a hand-drawn line. Another key to that hand-drawn look is texture. You don't see a ton of it in Among Us, but it is used sparingly in some key spots to suggest wear or detail. Inkscape may not be the most powerful tool for creating or managing textures, but I made over 170 vector textures by hand that you can download for free, along with other useful goodies like kitbashing assets and curated learning resources. I call it the Inkscape Starter Pack, and it's 100% free. Link in the description. Using them is the easy part. The hardest part is making the textures, and I've already done that for you. Just pick a texture you like, place it in place, and play around with the mode options, like with any other graphic software. Hopefully this video convinced you that making art at the level of something like Among Us isn't hard, as long as you know your way around Inkscape and understand the basics of vectorization. And if you want to learn more about that, I got tons of free tutorials on my channel, including several focused entirely on game art. But if you want to fast-track your skills, I've also put together a bundle of 14 Inkscape courses of mine, covering game art, characters, backgrounds, and more. That's over 70 hours of step-by-step Inkscape tutorials. Right now the full bundle is on sale for almost 90% off. Link in the description. Your support helps me keep making videos and giving away free stuff like the starter pack. So that's it for today. Just a small glimpse of what's possible with Inkscape for making game art. I plan to make more videos like this, so subscribe if you haven't, and a like and comment is also highly appreciated. Also, if there's a game you'd like me to try to recreate in Inkscape, let me know in the comments. I would love to expand on this concept, because I had a lot of fun with the Among Us prototype I made in Godot. So thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next tutorial. Bye! What you're seeing now is not gameplay from the game Limbo, or a similar looking game. It's a scene I built completely from scratch, using the free vector program Inkscape, with a little help from the Godot engine to put it in an interactive mockup. I wanted to demonstrate the point that you can absolutely create compelling game art, even in the style of Limbo, using nothing but vector tools, a mouse, and a bit of know-how. So in this video, I'll walk you through how I made everything, and hopefully convince you that vector software might just be the tool you didn't know you needed for your next game project. Limbo left a huge mark on me. Few games have visuals that feel as artistic and emotional as Limbo's, so this is a bit of an homage. Also, the silhouette-only style is perfect for working with vectors. It's clean, flexible, and surprisingly easy to build if you know what you're doing. That said, it's been over 15 years since I last played it. The only thing I remember is the opening forest section. That eerie atmosphere stuck with me. So I grabbed a reference gameplay video and decided to replicate the feel of that area. Not copy it asset by asset, but capture the same mood. Still, I'm not promising it'll look exactly like the original. There are a ton of visual effects in Limbo that are probably baked into the engine, and I don't have much experience with complex parallax scrolling or 2D lighting, so as I write this, I genuinely don't know how close it'll get. First step is roughing out the entire level. This helps me visualize the structure and get a better sense of how things will look before refining anything. These rectangles will represent one screen width. They are mainly there to help me establish the proportions and the overall geometry of the level. I also thought they'd help later with the parallax scrolling setup, but more on that in a minute. For now, I'm just blocking things out using simple shapes to build something inspired by the forest area from Limbo, not a one-to-one copy. The goal is to capture the feeling, not to recreate it asset by asset. Obviously, for this demo, I went with something way less complex than the original game. There are fewer layers and the details in each of them is simplified. The same goes for the visual effects, which I'll get into later. One of the most iconic parts of Limbo's art style is that beautiful parallax scrolling with all those layered silhouettes. I never actually worked with parallax before, and I wasn't even sure how to approach it in the engine, so I decided to do a quick test in Godot to figure out how it all works. I went with the simplest approach, exporting each layer as a single object. That's probably not how you'd handle it in a real game, but for a demo it gets the job done. Now, because parallax scrolling moves each layer at a different speed relative to the camera, I knew I'd probably have to tweak a lot of things, jumping back and forth between Inkscape and Godot. That's what gave me the idea to leave those rectangles as a camera size guide, hoping they'd help me line things up better later on. Spoiler, they didn't. They just got in the way. But at least now I know. But first, it would be nice to have a character in the demo. And I'm not animating one from scratch. It's too much work and it will take too much time. I first tried looking for a Limbo sprite sheet, but I couldn't find a proper one anywhere. And just when I was about to give up and draw a quick placeholder, I found this sprite sheet from the remake of the game, A Boy and His Blob. The character's proportions and animations were perfect. So I imported into Inkscape a few sheets that could pass as an idle, run, and jump animation. Because we only need the silhouette, I used the trace bitmap tool to get these shapes, and with a couple of ellipses for eyes and a few quick tweaks, I had something that really worked. Now back to the parallax test. I exported all the layers and dropped them into Godot to test the parallax scrolling options. I also added the character along with a quick script for running, jumping, and collisions. Here's how it worked out. Turns out I was worried for nothing. Making parallax scrolling in Godot was way easier than I expected. Once I started fiddling with the settings, everything just worked. I didn't have to constantly go back and forth between Inkscape and Godot like I feared. I had the power to adjust everything I needed inside the engine itself, which was a huge relief for me. What was more complicated were the visual effects. I wanted to see how many of Limbo's post-processing effects I could replicate directly inside of Godot. Vignette, noise, blur, glow, volumetric light. After 6 or 7 hours of wrestling with the shaders and asking ChatGPT for help, I managed to pull off a few of them. But it was rough. A lot of the answers I got were outdated or just wrong, and it slowed me down a lot. So I changed the plan again. I'll bake most of the effects directly into Inkscape layers. That includes depth of field and light rays. I'll finish each layer fully, then export them as complete backgrounds, just like the roughs. Now it's time to refine, and this part is easy. These are the silhouettes of branches, grass, and other forest bits. I made them the same way as the character, traced them from images, turned into vector shapes. They are vectors, so I can cut, merge, and reshape them however I want. Starting with the foreground, I begin layering these elements in. I'm not too worried about the exact placement. Once we move everything into Godot, I'll make some adjustments. I'm also using Inkscape's blur slider to fake the depth of field. I wish I could use a real DOF shader in Godot, but I couldn't pull it. This way I'm doing it is less than perfect. The ideal would have been to use the engine itself, but like I said, I'm not a programmer and ChatGPT was not being kind to me, especially with this particular shader. The one type of drawing I'm doing manually is sculpting the ground, so it looks more natural. Basically just adding some nodes and making it look nice and organic. I barely had to smooth any of the nodes, because when you look at them from far away, it still looks nice with simple straight edges. Super easy to do. After that, it's just a matter of pasting grass and branches all over the place. I repeated the same steps for the first background layer and a bit of the second one. First sculpting the ground and then pasting the grass and branch shapes to make it more natural. But here's the thing. The farther away, the less important it is to sculpt these shapes, since they are going to be more and more blurred. By the time we get to the back, it's mostly just large shapes and a soft light. At this point, I'm done with the drawing. What's left to do is the final touches in Godot, which are mostly shaders and other boring programming stuff, which I'm not gonna cover. The drawing part wasn't hard at all. Most of the challenge came from trying to replicate the engine effects and setting up everything in Godot. If you wanted, you could do this too. Just check out my channel for real-time, step-by-step tutorials where I show you exactly how to do this kind of work. And if you want to get started even faster, I have a bunch of asset packs and free resources in the description to help you jump in right away. Make sure to check them out. But if you really want to level up fast, I highly recommend grabbing my full courses bundle. It includes over 70 hours of training across 13 courses covering game art, character design, background design, rendering, and more. It's currently on heavy discount and it's the best way to support the channel while mastering vector illustration. Link in the description. And here it is. With a couple of final effects added, I'm happy with how it turned out. I did what I could, and I think it captures the Limbo vibe pretty well. That said, this was nothing like the Among Us recreation. Between my lack of coding skills and ChatGPT's sometimes weird answers, it was a painful process. Fun and rewarding, but painful. Anyway, I hope you enjoyed this video. Even though the illustration work was simple, the project felt big, and honestly really satisfying. If there is another game you'd like to see me tackle in Vector, let me know in the comments. And of course, like and subscribe if you enjoyed this. It really helps the channel. Thanks for watching and I'll see you next week. Bye. I've been a fan of Adventure Time since the show first aired. Of course, I still love it to this day, but as an artist, I fell in love with the art style, especially the way they designed the backgrounds. In this video I wanted to see if it's possible to create an Adventure Time style background using only Inkscape. I'll be drawing entirely with the keyboard and mouse, trying my very own background in the same style, and seeing how close I can get to the real thing. This style isn't the type you would want to use Inkscape or any other vector illustration software. It's highly detailed and involves a lot of complicated shapes and lines, so we might lose some of the finer details in the process. But I really love pushing the boundaries of what Inkscape can do for illustration, so let's see how it turns out. By the way, if you're interested in creating cartoon backgrounds with just the keyboard and mouse, I have a couple of courses on background design you might like. Right now they are on sale. You can get these two plus all my older courses, 11 in total, at a special price. Make sure to check out the link in the description. Let's take a quick look at the elements that makes up the Adventure Time style. And here I would like to give a shout out to Channel Frederator, the animation studio behind Adventure Time, for publishing free hundreds of production works, including full HD backgrounds, on their Flickr account. Having access to these resources made things so much easier than relying on screen caps, trying to see around characters, or trying to pause videos at the right moment. I really wish more studios do the same with other shows. Anyway, let's take a look at the elements that makes up this style. First, fairly realistic geometry. While the shapes and proportions of the objects are exaggerated a bit, it's not that much compared to other cartoons. Some objects look almost as proportioned as their real-life counterparts. Regarding shapes, the show often bends and twists shapes and tend to round off harsh corners, especially man-made. This results in a nice balance between comedic cartoon humor and the more serious, darker theme explored on the show. Second, outlines. On everything. The outlines vary in thickness depending on the season, with later seasons going for thinner lines. The outlines are also colored to match the object they belong to, being of a darker value. very Disney-esque. They are also affected by shadows, appearing darker in those areas. If you really zoom in, you can also see a bit of a texture going on. There is absolutely no way I'm gonna be able to replicate this in Inkscape, so I guess this will be the first compromise I'll have to make. Third, shadows and highlights. The show usually goes for a single cell shaded style shadow, but in more detailed areas you'll sometimes see two layers of shadow overlapping, or even a highlight. This aren't applied to every surface, it's only on strategic places where they want more detail. If you pay attention to the production of certain shows, you'll know that some of them use vector software for their backgrounds, or even for the entire animation. However, I'm pretty sure this was not made at all with vector software. Vector software works better when you have a style that uses a limited amount of simple and geometrical shapes. The Adventure Time style leans towards more realistic shapes and detailed lighting, which can be complicated to handle using vector shapes. That does make me a bit worried about how this will turn out in Inkscape. The truth is that I haven't tried to draw in this style up until this moment, so I really got no idea how the background will turn out. And the first step in making any type of background is doing a quick thumbnail to plan ahead how the illustration will look. This step is super important and absolutely not optional. I guess I could have done the thumbnail inside of Inkscape itself, like I've done so many times before, but I thought it would be faster and more efficient to just do a quick view with pencil. I'm not sure I'm entirely satisfied with the end result. This looks a bit too generic and doesn't feel like it's saying anything. I'm gonna be 100% honest. I started this video a couple of days before the publishing date of this video, so I was in a bit of time pressure. If I had more time, I would have done at least 10 more thumbnails and picked my favorite, but here I guess this is fine. The goal of this video was to demonstrate how capable was Inkscape to replicate the style, so you don't need an amazing composition. By the way, I have no idea what is this thing. I saw a couple of statues in the background's references, and I thought it would look cool to put something like that in the back as a bit of a surprise. But it didn't work out, and I ended up changing it later in the composition. Okay, with the thumbnail done, it is time to move on to Inkscape. But before actually making the final illustration, I want to solve the colors right here and now. And also I'm gonna take this opportunity to make some quick adjustments with the help of more references. So I'm gonna start tracing over the thumbnail using very rough and simplistic shapes, so I can, in a minute, give them color and get a bit of a colored thumbnail. I could have added the color in Krita when I was making the thumbnail, but I wanted to minimize the amount of work I did outside of Inkscape. Anyway, for the color I'm just sampling from the reference, and I'm adjusting by eye until everything looks nice. It is so much helpful to have the base colors that I'm gonna be using. And here it is, the finished color thumbnail, which gives me a nice pre-visualization of how the background could look once finished. And now it's finally time to go one by one with the references by my side, replacing each shape with the final asset. I got the colors, so all I have to do is to go in and take a look at the objects in the references and try to do something like that in my composition. Starting with this tree. I'm gonna replace this triangle with some type of foreground tree that I find in some reference. I've mentioned this in my background design courses. The goal here is not to straight away copy any particular object from the reference. Instead, you try to come up with something in the same vein to an object that you see. An instance of that type of object. That is how you really build up your visual library of cartoon objects. I love the way these subtle shadows here at the intersection really helps adding depth and giving this extra dimensionality. That is one of my favorite things about this style. It's also easy to do in Inkscape, since you can just use the opacity slider instead of changing the color of the shapes. I guess this is done in a similar way in a raster software with the right brush, but here is no problem. Making these small simple shapes that repeat in a pattern, in this case these blades of grass, it's always a pain in Inkscape. because you do have to place them manually. These types of objects are important enough that you can't use something like the spray tool to place them automatically. You have to duplicate them and place them manually, and on top you have to go one by one and modify them enough so they don't look like duplicates. It would have been so much easier to just draw them. They are such an easy and fast shape to draw too. Throughout this background I struggled with the lines, and in these next couple of sections you'll see what I mean. The problem is that in Inkscape you make lines by drawing open paths with no fill, and the pen tool is not the most intuitive tool to make complicated lines. You see it more clearly here on the highlights on the ground, where the shape of the highlight is way more simple than in the reference. I guess if you want to be really accurate, you can do something like that, a really complex shape with tons of breaks and all, but that will result in a very slow illustration process, plus you'll end up with shapes made of tons of nodes that are really difficult to control and reuse. And the same happens here with the moss in the stones. I don't think they ended up looking bad, but if you pay attention to the real background, you see the shape of the moss is much more expressive and complicated. This is something I realized immediately as I started trying to draw in this style with Inkscape. The line and the complexity of the shapes is gonna have to take a dive if you want to make something that looks finished. And this theme of reducing the complexity of the shapes will come up over and over again in different areas of the illustration, as you'll see in a minute. With more of the composition made, I came up with the realization that having a few more stones with moss, like in the thumbnail, would look a bit too repetitive. So looking at the references, I decided to make a few bushes instead. So here I just tried to copy the style of a couple of these bushes. Once in place, you'll notice that I will start to make some duplicates and mess around with the shape, so I can save up some time instead of drawing another bush from the ground up. Making quick variations of different objects is not always possible. In the case of these bushes, I had to make so many modifications that I might as well would have redrawn them all from the ground up. But reusing parts of the illustration that you've already drawn is one of the strongest points of a vector illustration software, so you have to always be on the lookout for that. And that comes to play here with these semi-detailed backtrees. I did redraw a few of them to have variation, but they are all more or less subtle variations of the same shapes, which makes them perfect for classic vector style reutilization. These trees at the left are important because they're gonna be just a little bit more detailed, working as a bit of a secondary focal point. I based this tree on one particular type of tree that appears somewhere in the middle ground in most of the references. I really wanted at least a few more or less detailed trees. Because I had to draw 4 of them, this resulted in an exercise in trying to reuse as much as possible. I drew a single tree, and all of the other ones were copies. I did try to make each of them as distinct as possible, going in there and manually adding and removing things, and I think the end result looks nice and it doesn't look that much like duplicates. The clouds. I'm fully happy with the way the clouds came out. Again, just like with the bushes and with the moss, the original style has much more complicated and overlapping shapes. At this point, I had already given up with the idea of making everything as close to the original, and I just embraced the limitations of the vector shapes. So, yep, the clouds are much simpler, yet I still think I managed to capture their feeling of movement and twist. At this point, I realized that the statue will not work as the main focal point, and of course, I started to regret not spending a bit more time on the thumbnail. Anyway, I came up with the idea of using one of the mountains as the focal point and put it in the center. So I made this big, detailed mountain that I will reuse to make all the other ones. But I still thought there was something missing to separate it from all the other ones. And I decided to copy an idea from the references. I'm gonna use a cloud wrapping around it. First, I duplicated the mountains and adapted to the other shapes, while making small modifications so each of them looked different enough. Making the spiral cloud was all about compromise, but I'm happy with the way it came out, and again I feel like it just captures the feeling of the original one. The same with the other two big clouds at the bottom. I feel like I could have added more detail, but I guess that's enough. You could refine an illustration forever if you wanted. At some moment you have to abandon it. And I think after 6 hours of drawing entirely in Inkscape, and with a wrist in pain, I was happy to end it. So here is the end result. And now that I see it all finished, I can see a million mistakes that I would like to dive into and fix, but I'm not gonna. I think it looks good enough, and while it may not get confused with a proper Adventure Time background, the whole goal of this exercise was to learn. And I think I learned a lot about how to handle more complicated styles, and fight a bit with the vector medium, and how to compromise to get the feeling of detail. After 6 or so hours working in this style, I can say that it's not a style I would go for if I had to work entirely on Inkscape. But I can certainly see some element of it that can be used to make a more medium-friendly style that is not so time and energy consuming to draw. I had a lot of fun with it, and I hope you had fun watching this video. If you like it and would like to see more of it, you can support me by giving it a like and subscribing to the channel. I do plan to make more of this type of video where I take a style and see if I can replicate it. So let me know in the comments what is the next style I should tackle with Inkscape. Also, don't forget to check out in the description the link to the special promo. Remember, it's only for a limited time. That was it for now. I really hope you had fun. See you next week. Bye. This is Sam & Max Hit the Road, remastered in HD. Now, before you get too excited, no, there hasn't been an official HD remaster announced for this classic 1993 point-and-click adventure. This is my personal project where I traced over this iconic scene using the free vector software Inkscape and the Godot engine to put it in an interactive mockup. In this video I'll show you how you can use the power of vector graphics to create an HD remaster of any pixel game you may want. I'll walk you through my entire process, share the tools I used, and give you tips I learned along the way. If you're a Sonic 2 fan like me, you've probably been keeping an eye on the amazing fan-made HD remaster that's coming up. But what you may not know is that the project apparently was made using vector tools, and it works like a charm for the graphics of Sonic 2. This got me thinking, could the same approach work for the more detailed, painterly adventure games? I wanted to test this by tackling one of those gorgeous LucasArts Sierra adventures from the early 90s, games with incredible art that's trapped in those tiny 320 by 240 resolutions. While games like Day of the Tentacle and Full Throttle have gotten official HD remasters, I wanted to try something that hasn't been touched yet. So I choose one of my all-time favorites, Sam & Max Hit the Road. But first, we need a bit of understanding of what makes a game suited for a vector remaster, because not all games will work nicely with this approach. Back in the 80s and 90s, pixel art wasn't so much a deliberate style as it was a technical limitation. Games could be trying to emulate anything from photorealism to cartoon styles, but they were all forced into low resolutions. For vector remastering, games with clear, cartoony shapes work best. Sam & Max sits in an interesting middle ground. It has those strong cartoon shapes and simple lighting, but also contains subtle texture that can prove to be challenging to recreate. Still, this is doable, but I wouldn't go for something more detailed and realistic than this. But before starting the actual tracing, I just revived my old Instagram account. If you want to see extra content like mini tutorials or behind the scene bits that don't make it into the videos, go follow me there. And while you're at it, why not like this video, subscribe and drop a comment. It really helps the channel. Okay, let's start the tracing of the background. And the first thing I want to say is that I learned a lot with this project. I've never traced an entire background before, I was used to tracing over my own drawings that I do with my tablet, so I assumed that it would be something similar. Turns out I was completely wrong. I wasted a ton of time, and I mean a ton. This entire project took me about 10 hours of tracing, and I feel I could have saved at least 4 with the right method. The mistake was that I tried using my usual character tracing workflow, working on layers below the reference with filled shapes. For a complex, fully colored background, this was a nightmare, constantly fighting to select the right shape through all that visual noise and stopping every 5 seconds to sample colors and reorder shapes. The breakthrough came when I switched to tracing over the reference with simple lines first, focusing on completely small sections at a time and adding color and finalizing everything in a second pass. This made everything faster and mentally clearer. A very common problem that arises as you attempt to trace over is that because the reference is so low resolution, there may be areas where you can't tell what a shape is supposed to be. Like for example, take a look at these bars, the connection with the wall. If you zoom right in, you see that they are a group of 9 pixels. This doesn't really have all the information needed to clearly communicate how this object is connected to the wall. When you see a low resolution image like this, because of that lack of information, your brain does a lot of work to fill in the gaps. But now you need to do it in HD. There is no filling of gaps. You have to draw the shape explicitly. The same with the newspapers that are falling off the mailbox. I can't even tell how many there are. Or the cracks on the corner of the sidewalk. If you zoom in, you'll notice that there is not a well-defined shape to follow. All of this means that you'll have to make it up, and information where there isn't. And if you need, you should supply that lack of information with extra reference. A related problem is what happens here on this wall. Some things that work in pixel art will definitely not work in vector form in HD. I got no idea what those lines are supposed to be. I guess they imply some highlight in the bricks in the dark area. This will not work in vector form. Here's where you have to make a decision of how much accurate you'd like your art to look. In this case, I decided these lines took away more than what they added, and I decided they will not be in the traceover. One thing I found immediately is that an HD remaster requires hundreds of these little judgment calls, deciding what to keep, what to change, and how to stay faithful while making it work in a new medium. Like I said earlier, I've never done this type of full background traceover, and I was a bit naive with the times. I expected to finish a background in, at most, 3 hours. I wanted to make the first 3 backgrounds of the game and then publish a quick demo you could play, but I was so wrong. This single background plus the characters took me like 10 hours or more, and I couldn't justify that time on the other ones. So this made me question, is vector art too slow for this? Is mouse drawing impractical? And here's the thing. This is primarily an Inkscape channel. So when I do these tests and challenges, I limit myself to using only Inkscape, even if there are better tools for the job. In a real project, I'm mixing raster tools like Krita to complement the areas where Inkscape will not do, like textures, for example. So I decided to make a quick test to see if tracing entirely in Krita would be considerably faster to the point it would make tracing in Inkscape obsolete. I actually started to record myself and all, but I immediately realized that it was actually slower than Inkscape, especially if you use my technique of working in line first and adding the colors later. So I never end up finishing that background. So yes, remastering with vectors is overall faster, at least for this type of backgrounds, though combining tools will be ideal. Okay, a quick word about fonts. I could have used a similar looking typeface, but in my experience finding perfect matches is really hard and time consuming and never looks exactly the same. So I decided to trace each letter manually. It was way slower, but it looks so much better than using some generic letters that don't fully fit. The textures were the one thing that worried me the most about this project. As you may know, Inkscape is not ideal for textures. First is the texture of the red building. This was surprisingly easy to do and looked almost identical to the reference. Maybe the original artist followed a similar process than I did. I just used this texture from an open game art pack of textures. It worked like a charm using the lighting mode. I'm actually surprised how close it got to the original. The grunge and dirtiness textures all over the building and sidewalks and signs were a bit more complicated. A simple texture won't do. I decided to stick entirely to Inkscape and use my textures pack, which contains over 170 vector textures I made by hand. It is available in my Inkscape Jumpstart pack, which has a few other interesting goodies that can help you get started with Inkscape. It's absolutely free, link in the description. Now it's just a matter of using my textures to spread them strategically all over, so they look as close to the original as possible. Being vector textures, it will never look 100% like the reference. Sometimes you have to embrace that your copy is not gonna look 100% identically, and that is not something bad. Very often the vector medium imposes its limitations on you, and you have to either work around them or embrace them. In the case of the textures, I think they look similar enough, and more importantly, it looks good on its own, which is what is important in the end. And now the final step, which is tracing over the sprites. This will be on its own layer in the engine. Some of them will be animated and the other, like this car, will be static, but the playable character Sam will be able to go in front and behind. There's nothing new here, I'm following the exact same process than before, tracing on top and then coloring on a second pass. By this moment I became quite fast and effective at tracing and I'm finishing way faster. This is the great thing about these projects, is that even if you're not drawing something new, you always learn something that you can reuse in your projects. In this case, I was able to immediately get the correct order of the complex shapes of the car in a second, something that would have taken me much more time to do if I didn't went through all of those hours of trace before. Then there are the characters. I found these sprites in the same place I found all the art, in the Spriters resource. Great page, by the way, which as far as I know has sprites ripped directly from the games themselves. They look a bit too wide for me, but I'll fix that later on. A couple of notes here. As you can see, the sprite sheet has a ton of animations. For walking alone, it has a top, down and side version, and some very complex idle animations. In the game, Sam and Max walk together, but Max often moves around the scene on its own. I decided, in order to save time, and because this is just a humble demo, that I would only move Sam and Max will stay static in the corner. Also, I simplified Sam's movement by only making him have a single idle frame and only a walk left and right animation. I think the end result looked good, and you can barely tell there are animations missing. Anyway, this time I followed the same process than before, but now there is line art. That means I have to pay attention to what are the pixels trying to convey, what directions and thickness. Again, all that information is missing here, and you have to reconstruct it in your head, just by looking at the art. By the way, I'm using the bucket tool technique that I love to use with characters. You'll know what I mean if you're a regular of the channel. It's a super fast technique to trace over characters without complicating yourself with solid shapes. In this case, even if the characters are animated, it's done frame by frame, and that means we can use the bucket tool technique to save some time. Other than that, the only problem it came out was that I felt the Sam illustration felt a bit flat. I was constantly tempted to add some shadow or thicken the lines at some places, but I restricted myself to the most literal translation of the pixel art to the vector form as possible, adding shadow and thickness only where it was on the pixel art. I was committed to make a remaster, not a remake of the assets, and there were so many areas where I was tempted to improvise. And here is it, the final background and the characters. All of this was done with minimal knowledge of Inkscape. So if you want to remaster your own games, even for games like graphical adventures, it is not that difficult. All you need is a basic understanding of the concepts behind vector illustration, which of course you can get in my channel. I have a ton of free step-by-step tutorials, there's even an entire Inkscape mini course to get you up and running as fast as possible. But if you really want to further accelerate your learning, I can recommend you my 13 courses pack. That's over 70 hours of Inkscape tutorials going over character design, background design, game art, and more. You'll be remastering your favorite games in no time. Right now it's on sale, link in the description. By purchasing this pack, you're helping me and the channel come out with more free tutorials and resources. Anyway, this is the end result in the game engine. I think it's quite convincing as a remaster of the game. It certainly looks better than an AI upscale. I know because somebody upscaled this exact background and it just doesn't look right. And yes, it is true, some of the finer details got lost in the translation to vector form, but I think it looks great on its own and it's hyper faithful anyway. So that was it for this video. Please don't forget to like and subscribe for more videos on Inkscape and game art, and let me know in the comments what other games should I replicate or even remaster in the future. I know I have some ideas in mind, but I would really like to see your suggestions. That's all, see you next week. Bye.